You didn't imagine it. You didn't exaggerate it. You didn't misread the room, misremember the conversation, or blow something small out of proportion. What happened, happened. The way it landed in your chest, the way it kept you up at 3 a.m, replaying every word, the way it changed something permanently in how you see that person. All of that is real and all of that is valid. So why is it that the person who caused it is out there living their best life, completely unbothered, acting like the two of you just had a minor scheduling conflict instead of a moment that cracked something open in you? You've seen it. Maybe you're living it right now. The person who said something devastating to you is posting vacation photos. The friend who cut you off without explanation just liked your Instagram story. The partner who blindsided you with a breakup is already making plans with other people, laughing loudly, moving fast, leaving no visible evidence that you ever mattered. And you're sitting here carrying the full weight of something they apparently set down the moment they walked away. That imbalance, you with the wreckage, them with the clean hands, is one of the most quietly maddening experiences a human being can have. Not because the pain itself is unbearable, but because their ease makes you question the pain in the first place. Here's what nobody talks about when they talk about healing. The hardest part isn't always the initial hurt. Sometimes the hardest part is watching someone walk around completely fine after hurting you. Because at least if they were struggling, at least if you could see some evidence that what happened between you had weight for them too, you'd have something to hold on to. You'd have something to hold on to. You'd have confirmation that it was real. Instead, you get nothing. You get them breezing past you in the hallway, or texting you a meme, or asking to borrow something like the ground between you isn't still scorched. And something in your brain starts doing this dangerous thing where it tries to make sense of the math. If they're fine and I'm not fine either, what happened wasn't as serious as I thought, or something is wrong with me. Nothing is wrong with you, but something very specific is happening with them. And once you understand what it actually is, it won't make you feel better in the way a clean apology would, but it will do something more powerful than that. It will set you free from the need for one. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where most people get it wrong. The common assumption is that someone who hurt you and acts unbothered must not care, must not be thinking about it, must have conveniently deleted the whole thing from their memory, the way you delete a photo you don't like. It feels like amnesia. It looks like indifference. And from where you're standing, with all that weight still sitting in your chest, their lightness reads like a confession, proof that you never really mattered to them at all. But that's not what's happening. And the truth is both more complicated and, in a strange way, more useful to understand. Memory doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. In fact, neuroscience tells us the opposite is true. Emotionally charged events, the ones loaded with conflict, betrayal, shame, intensity, get encoded more deeply than neutral ones. The argument, the moment you told them how much they hurt you, the look on your face, the silence that followed. Those moments don't get filed in some forgettable drawer. They get burned in. They remember more than they'd ever admit, and in some cases more than they're even consciously aware of. The issue is never the P, memory. The issue is what they do with it. Because here's the thing about human psychology that changes everything. Remembering something and being willing to sit with what it means are two completely different skills. And one of them is a skill most people have never been asked to develop. We live in a world that rewards people for moving on quickly, for being easygoing, for not making things heavy or complicated or hard. The person who brings up how something hurt them is labeled sensitive. The person who lets it go and smiles is labeled mature. We've built a whole social culture around rewarding avoidance and calling it strength. So when someone hurts you and then acts like nothing happened, they are not operating from a place of cruelty, at least not always. They're operating from a place of profound self-protection. Their brain has learned over years sometimes over a lifetime. That the fastest way out of discomfort is to simply refuse to acknowledge that the discomfort exists, not consciously, not with some deliberate plan, but automatically, the way you pull your hand back from heat before your brain has even finished processing the word hot, the casual meme, the easy smile, the borrowed stapler. None of that is peace, it's performance. And the audience for that performance isn't even you, it's themselves. Every normal interaction they have after hurting someone is their nervous system trying to outrun the weight of what they did by generating evidence that everything is fine. If they can behave normally, maybe it was normal. If they can seem unbothered, maybe there's nothing to be bothered about. If they can act like you're still just two ordinary people in an ordinary situation, maybe the story they tell themselves about being a good person gets to stay intact. That's the thing you've been feeling and couldn't quite name. You're not imagining the distance between your experience and theirs. You're not being dramatic. You're accurately sensing that the two of you are operating in completely different realities right now. And understanding exactly how that happened and why is what the rest of this is going to be about. Because the real reason they can hurt you and act like nothing happened has nothing to do with how much you mattered. It has everything to do with how much they can't afford to let themselves know that they caused harm. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. There's a concept in psychology called the self-concept. It sounds clinical, but the idea is almost embarrassingly simple. Every person walking around on this planet has a story they tell themselves about who they are. Not who they wish they were, not who they present to the world, but who they believe themselves to be at the core. And for most people, that story contains some version of the same sentence. I am a good person. I try to do right by others. I don't intentionally hurt people. That story isn't vanity. It's load-bearing. It is holding up the entire structure of how they move through the world, how they make decisions, how they sleep at night, how they look at themselves in the mirror every morning and feel okay about what they see. Now imagine something happens that directly contradicts that story. Imagine they do something that causes real damage to someone who trusted them. Imagine they say something that cuts deeper than they meant to, or abandon someone at a moment when staying would have cost them something, or choose their own comfort so consistently that someone else's needs quietly suffocate. Suddenly the story has a problem. The evidence doesn't match the narrative. And this is where the human brain does something remarkable and remarkably dishonest. It doesn't update the story. It edits the evidence. Psychologist Cash Care called this cognitive dissonance, the state of holding two conflicting beliefs at the same time. And the research is consistent and slightly humbling for all of us. When people face a contradiction between their actions and their self-image, they almost never resolve it by changing their self-image. That would require too much demolition. Instead, they change their memory, their interpretation, or their framing of the event until the contradiction disappears. They perform what researchers call motivated reasoning, not lying exactly, but something more slippery than lying. They genuinely reconstruct the story until it's one they can live with. So the friend who forgot your birthday 3 years in a row doesn't sit with the reality that they consistently deprioritize you. They remember being very busy, very overwhelmed, meaning to reach out. The colleague who threw you under the bus in that meeting doesn't carry the weight of having chosen their own reputation over yours. They remember the situation being complicated, the pressure being high, doing what they had to do. The partner who left without warning, without conversation, without any of the decency you deserved, they don't hold themselves accountable for the way they handled it. They remember the relationship having already been over. You both having drifted, it just being time. The original version of events, your version, the accurate one, has been quietly renovated. New walls, fresh paint, a different floor plan, and because they did the renovation themselves, without an architect, without anyone checking the work, they walk through it and think it looks exactly right. This is why Trying to make someone take accountability by simply explaining what happened more clearly almost never works. You think the problem is that they don't fully understand what they did. So you find better words, more precise language. Oh, try a different angle, a different example, a different framing. You stay calm when you want to scream because you think if you can just communicate it cleanly enough, something will click. But the problem isn't comprehension. The problem is that their brain has already decided what happened, and your version threatens a story they cannot afford to let go of. More information doesn't help. It just gives them more material to argue against. There's a second mechanism at work here too, one that operates alongside the self-concept maintenance, and it's perhaps even more insidious. Psychologists call it moral disengagement. It's a set of mental strategies, most of them unconscious, that people use to neutralize the guilt that would otherwise come with having caused harm. And these strategies are sophisticated. They are not the clumsy rationalizations you might imagine. They are smooth, practiced, almost invisible, even to the person using them. The first strategy is minimization. What happened wasn't that serious. People go through hard things. You'll be fine. The pain gets made smaller until it seems manageable, which is to say, until it seems like something that doesn't require them to do anything about it. The second strategy is displacement of responsibility. I was going through so much at the time. You know how stressed I was. The situation was impossible. The hurt you experience becomes a byproduct of circumstances rather than a result of their choices. They didn't do it to you, it just happened. And you both happened to be there. The third strategy is the most disorienting, and it's the one that will make your head spin if you've ever experienced it. They recast themselves as the victim. Suddenly, in the retelling that happens inside their own head, they are the one who was wrong. You were too demanding, too sensitive, too much. You pushed them into the position they were in. You created the conditions that led to them behaving the way they did. And if they're really committed to the renovation, they might even begin to feel genuinely aggrieved, a real felt sense of injustice that has no basis in what actually occurred, but that their nervous system now experiences as true. When you encounter this version of them, the one who seems genuinely confused by your hurt, or worse, genuinely wounded by your attempt to address it, you are not dealing with someone who has done the work and come to a different conclusion. You are dealing with someone who has completed a full psychological renovation and is now living in the new building. They're not pretending. They're not consciously gaslighting you. They have simply chosen, below the level of conscious choice, a version of reality that allows them to remain who they need to believe they are. And you are standing outside the new building, holding blueprints of the original, wondering why nothing looks the way you remember. So now you understand the architecture of how they got there. You understand the self-concept, the cognitive renovation, the moral disengagement strategies that run like background software, quietly rewriting history, so the person who caused the damage never has to face the full cost of what they built and then destroyed. But there's still a piece of this that doesn't quite add up. Because even if all of that is true, even if their brain has done all that invisible work to protect them from accountability, you would still expect some evidence of discomfort, some flicker of awkwardness when they see you, some hesitation before they send the casual text, some small signal that the body remembers even when the mind has convinced itself there's nothing to remember. Instead, you get nothing, worse than nothing. You get warmth, you get ease, you get them acting lie. The two of you are perfectly fine, like the air between you is clean, like there is no wreckage, no history, no version of events that ever needed addressing. And that specific thing, that smoothness, that almost aggressive normalcy is the part that makes people feel like they're losing their mind. Because if the person who hurt you seems genuinely unbothered, genuinely comfortable, genuinely at ease in your presence, then either what happened wasn't real or you're the problem. Those feel like the only two options. And your brain, desperate for the math to make sense, starts quietly considering both. This is the part nobody warns you about. Not the initial hurt, not even the lack of apology. The part that does the deepest damage is the way their comfort destabilizes your reality. Because we are not built for isolation. We are wired deeply and biologically for consensus, for shared reality, for the confirmation that what we experienced was real because someone else was there and they experienced it too. When the person who was there refuses to confirm the experience, when they look at you with genuine confusion or easy warmth and behave as though nothing happened, something in your nervous system starts to wobble. The ground that felt solid under your feet, your own memory, your own perception, your own sense of what is real, begins to feel less certain. You start doing something that feels like fairness, but is actually a form of self-erasure. You start giving them the benefit of the doubt in a direction that only ever costs you. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe I am being too sensitive. Maybe I'm holding on to this longer than I should be. Maybe the fact that they seem fine means I should be fine too. And every time you extend that doubt toward yourself, instead of toward them, you hand over a small piece of your own authority over your experience, bit by bit. The story of what happened gets softer at the edges, less certain, more disputed, until you're no longer sure enough of your own version to defend it, even to yourself. There is a word that gets thrown around a lot in these conversations, sometimes so much that it loses its weight. But the dynamic it describes is real, and it is exactly what is happening here. When someone causes harm and then behaves in a way that makes you question your own perception of that harm, whether consciously or not, the effect on you is the same. Your reality is being destabilized by their refusal to share it. And the cruelest part is that they don't have to be doing it on purpose for it to wreck you just as completely. Here's what is actually happening in their interior world during all of this, because it matters more than it might seem. The performance of ease, the casual texts, the borrowed staplers, the smooth, unbothered energy, none of that is free. Suppression always has a price, even when the bill hasn't arrived yet. Research on emotional avoidance is remarkably consistent on this point. People who chronically suppress us and avoid processing difficult emotions don't become peaceful. They become defended. There is a meaningful difference. Peace is spacious. Defense is rigid. Peace can tolerate being questioned. Defense cannot. Peace allows someone to sit in a room with the person they hurt and feel something genuine. Defense requires the constant management of every interaction to ensure the locked door stays locked. Watch carefully the next time someone like this is in a situation that gets too close to what they don't want to face. The subject gets changed. The tone gets louder or lighter or more performative. They make a joke. They suddenly have somewhere to be. They pivot with a speed and smoothness that looks almost elegant. And you find yourself wondering how you ended up talking about something completely different without ever deciding to change the subject. That's not charm. That's a nervous system running a very efficient avoidance program. They have been doing it so long that the pivots are seamless. The exits are invisible. Management of uncomfortable proximity is so practiced it looks effortless. And here is the most important thing to understand about people who are living behind that kind of defense. They are not okay. They are not winning. The version of them you see, loose and easy and unburdened, is a maintenance project. It requires daily upkeep. Every interaction with you, every reminder of what happened, every moment that gets too close to that locked room costs them energy they'll never acknowledge spending. The toll is real. It just gets paid in ways you can't see, in anxiety that attaches itself to other things, in relationships that stay permanently surface level, in a vague and sourceless restlessness that follows them from situation to situation without ever being traceable back to its origin. You're doing the harder thing. You're standing in the rubble and actually looking at it. you are feeling the full weight of what happened without outsourcing that weight to a renovation project. That is not weakness. That is the only path that actually leads somewhere. And where it leads is exactly what we need to talk about next. There is a moment that happens for some people, not all at once, not dramatically, not with any particular fanfare, where something quietly shifts, where you stop waiting for them to confirm what happened and start trusting yourself as the only confirmation you actually need. That moment doesn't arrive because someone finally validated you or because the person who hurt you had a sudden awakening and showed up with the apology you deserved, or because enough time passed that the pain simply dissolved on its own. It arrives because you make a decision, conscious and deliberate, to stop outsourcing your reality to someone who has already demonstrated they are not a reliable witness to it. That decision is harder than it sounds, because somewhere underneath all the anger and the confusion and the exhaustion of carrying this alone, there is a quieter grief that doesn't get talked about enough. The grief of the closure you are not going to get. This is real loss. Not a metaphor for loss, not a mild disappointment, but genuine grief for something you deserved and were denied. You deserved an acknowledgement. You deserve someone to look at you and say, yes, that happened. Yes, I played a role in it. Yes, your pain makes complete sense. That is not an unreasonable thing to have needed. It is the most human thing in the world to need. And the fact that they couldn't give it to you is not a reflection of whether you deserved it. It is only a reflection of what they are currently capable of. Those are not the same thing, and keeping them separate in your mind is one of the most important things you can do for yourself right now. Grieve it. Actually grieve it. Don't rush past it toward the lesson or the growth or the silver lining, because grief that gets skipped doesn't disappear. It just finds somewhere else to live. Let yourself feel the specific disappointment of realizing this person does not have the emotional range to meet you where you needed them. Let yourself mourn the version of them you thought you knew, the one who would have shown up differently, the one who existed in your mind before the reality of who they actually are became impossible to ignore. That mourning is not weakness. It is not you clinging to the past. It is you being honest about what was lost, which is the only way to eventually stop losing it over and over again in quiet moments when you led. Ask, expect it. And then, when you're ready, do the thing that requires the most courage of everything we've talked about today. Give yourself what they wouldn't give you. This is not about affirmations in the mirror or convincing yourself you're fine before you are. It is about something more specific and more powerful than that. It is about looking at your own experience and treating it as the authority. You know what happened. You were there. Your memory of it is not made less accurate by the fact that they dispute it. Your pain is not made less real by the fact that they don't share it. Your version of events is not made less true by the fact that they've built a different building on the same ground. You are the witness to your own life. Start acting like it. Here's the reframe that changes everything, and I want you to sit with it rather than rushing past it. Their inability to acknowledge what they did is not actually about you at all. It never was. It is entirely, completely, 100% about the limits of what they can afford to face about themselves. People who are secure enough in their own identity, who have done enough internal work to know that acknowledging a mistake doesn't annihilate them. Those people can sit in the discomfort of having caused harm and still come out the other side intact. They can say, I hurt you. I'm sorry. I understand why that damaged things. And they can mean it because their entire sense of self doesn't depend on having always been perfect. But someone who has built their identity on a foundation that cannot tolerate cracks, who has never learned that you can be flawed and still be worthy, that person cannot afford your version of events. It costs too much, and you cannot negotiate with someone whose survival feels like it depends on not hearing you. So you stop trying to get through to them, not out of bitterness, not out of giving up on the possibility of human growth, because growth is real and people do change. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes years later in ways that will surprise you. But you stop making their growth a condition of your own. You stop tying your ability to move forward to whether or not they ever open that locked room, because that is a timeline you cannot control, and waiting on it is a way of handing them power over your life that they have not earned and do not deserve. What you take with you from this is not cynicism. It is clarity. You now know something about this person's current capacity that you did not fully know before. You know where their ceiling is. You know what they reach for when accountability becomes available to them. That is not a small thing to know. That is exactly the kind of information that changes how you build going forward, what you require from the people you let close, what you recognize early before it costs you everything, what you refuse to explain away or minimize or absorb quietly into yourself because someone else needs you to be smaller. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are not the problem for remembering, for feeling it, for refeeling it, for refusing to act like nothing happened when something very clearly did. You are someone who takes what happens between people seriously. The world needs more of that, not less. They hurt you and acted like nothing happened. Now you know exactly why. And more importantly, you know that their nothing was never the truth. Your something always was. There is a specific moment, and if it has happened to you, you will know exactly what I mean, where you are doing something completely ordinary. You are standing in your kitchen making coffee. You are sitting in a meeting you have attended 100 times before. You are lying next to someone you love, in a bed that is familiar, in a life that by every external measure is working. And then without warning, without cause, without any event to blame it on, something shifts, not dramatically, not with noise or collapse. It is quieter than that. It is the sudden, unsettling awareness that you are watching your own life from the outside, that the person going through the motions, pouring the coffee, nodding in the meeting, breathing in the dark, is you, but also somehow not you anymore. And for a moment, maybe just a few seconds, you feel the full strangeness of being alive inside a life that no longer quite fits. Most people push that feeling down before it can finish its sentence. They call it tiredness. They call it stress. They blame the season or the workload or the fact that they haven't taken a holiday in 2 years. They do this because what the feeling is actually saying is too large to hear all at once. What it is saying is something is ending, and something else, something you cannot yet see, is about to begin. This is not a video about crisis. It is not a video about breakdown or burnout, or the dramatic unraveling that makes for compelling personal essays. This is a video about something far more precise and far less understood. It is about the moment before everything changes. The moment when the internal world has already made its decision and the external world simply hasn't received the news yet. And it is about why the people who understand what that moment actually is, what is biologically, psychologically, and structurally happening inside them, come through it as someone more real, more capable, and more alive than they have ever been, while the people who don't understand it get destroyed by the very same process. Carl Jung called it the most important passage a human being could undergo. He didn't mean that lightly. Jung was not a man given to exaggeration. He was precise, demanding, and deeply skeptical of the kind of easy comfort that most people mistake for genuine insight. When he said important, he meant irreversible. He meant that once this process begins and completes itself fully, the person on the other side is not a better version of who they were. They are categorically different. The scaffolding that held up the old identity, the roles, the self-concepts, the carefully maintained image of who you are, does not get renovated. It gets removed. And what stands without it is something that was there all along, buried beneath years of adaptation, performance, and survival. But here is what Jung understood that almost no one talks about. The process does not begin when you feel it. It does not begin with the strange moment in the kitchen, or the hollow feeling in the meeting, or the quiet terror in the dark. Those are not the start. Those are the surfacing. The process began months ago, possibly years ago, deep in the architecture of the unconscious, where the self has been quietly running calculations you were never conscious of, adding up every compromise you made against your own instincts. Every time you performed a version of yourself that kept the peace but cost you something real. Every morning you woke up and chose the life that was expected over the life that was yours. The unconscious registers all of it, and at a certain point determined not by your schedule or your readiness or your convenience, it decides that the accumulation is complete. That the tension between who you are performing and who you actually are has reached a pressure the system can no longer contain, and it begins to move. The reason this feels so disorienting when it surfaces is that we have been trained from childhood to believe that we are the authors of our own inner lives, that we decide what to feel and when to feel it. That change is something we initiate, plan, and execute on a timeline we control. And then something like this happens, and suddenly the authorship is gone. You didn't choose this. You didn't schedule it. You can't explain it to the people around you because there is no event to point to, no reason that would satisfy someone who hasn't felt it themselves. And the gap between what you are experiencing internally and what your external life is asking you to perform grows wider every single day. Neuroscience has begun to catch up with what Jung observed a century ago. Researchers studying identity and neural plasticity have found that the brain undergoes periods of massive internal reorganization that precede significant behavioral and psychological change. During these periods, the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for your sense of self, your autobiographical narrative, your feeling of continuity across time, becomes destabilized. The internal story you have been telling about who you are stops running smoothly. There are gaps. There is static. The narrative that has held your identity together begins to dissolve at the edges. And this is experienced not as insight, not as clarity, but as a strange, formless anxiety. A sense that something is wrong that you cannot locate. A restlessness that no amount of activity can resolve, not because something is wrong, but because the brain is in the process of building a new architecture of self, and it cannot do that without first dismantling the old one. You are not falling apart. You are being rebuilt from the inside. And the question that will determine everything about how this goes, the question that separates the people who emerge from this process into genuine freedom from the people who spend years circling the edge of it without ever breaking through, is not whether the change is coming. It is already here. The question is whether you understand what it is before it finishes without you. There is a reason the people closest to you cannot see what you are going through. And it is not because they don't care. It is not because they are inattentive or self-absorbed or incapable of empathy. It is because what is happening to you is not visible from the outside. From the outside, your life looks exactly the same as it did 6 months ago. You go to the same places. You say the right things at the right times. You show up. You function. You perform the daily choreography of your existence with enough competence that no one around you has any reason to sound an alarm. But inside, in the place where you actually live, something has gone profoundly quiet in a way that is louder than any noise you have ever heard. This is the first thing you need to understand about sudden transformation. It is never actually sudden. What is sudden is only the moment it becomes undeniable, the moment the internal reality breaks through the surface of the external performance and refuses to be managed back down. But the transformation itself, the real structural reorganization happening beneath conscious awareness, has been running in the background for a long time, like a software update that downloads silently overnight and only reveals itself when you open your device in the morning and find that everything has rearranged. You didn't feel it installing. You couldn't have. It wasn't happening in a register you have access to. But it was happening. It has been happening. And now it is nearly complete. Jung identified 3 specific phases in this underground process, and understanding them is not an academic exercise. Understanding them is the difference between meeting this experience with intelligence and meeting it with panic. The first phase he called the withdrawal of projection. This sounds technical. It is not. It simply means this: for most of your life, you have been experiencing your inner world as if it were the outer world. The anger you couldn't acknowledge in yourself, you experienced as other people being unfair. The fear you couldn't sit with, you experienced as circumstances being dangerous. A longing for something more, something realer, something that actually fit who you are. You projected outward into goals and relationships and achievements, hoping that if you could just get the external configuration right, the internal ache would finally resolve. And for a long time, this works well enough. The projections hold. The external world cooperates with the story. But at a certain point, the unconscious begins reclaiming what it projected. It begins pulling those displaced parts of yourself back inward, where they belong. And when it does, the external world stops making sense in the way it used to. The relationship that was carrying your projection of love starts to feel ordinary. The career that was carrying your projection of meaning starts to feel hollow. The identity that was carrying your projection of worth starts to feel like a costume someone else designed. This is not disillusionment in the cynical sense. This is not the world becoming less. This is you becoming more than the projections can contain. The withdrawal is not a loss. It is a retrieval. Every piece of yourself that comes back from where you had displaced it is a piece of yourself that is now actually available to you. But in the moment of retrieval, it does not feel like gain. It feels like grief. It feels like standing in a room that used to feel like home and realizing, with quiet devastation, that it never actually was. The second phase Jung identified was what he called the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not the dark side of human nature in any dramatic or cinematic sense. The shadow is simply everything you decided, somewhere along the way, was unacceptable. The ambition you were told was arrogance. The anger you were taught was dangerous. The needs you learned to hide because having them made other people uncomfortable. The parts of yourself that didn't fit the version of you that got rewarded, included, and loved. Those parts didn't disappear. Nothing in the psyche disappears. They went underground. They formed the shadow. And they have been operating from there ever since, shaping your choices, your reactions, your relationships, and your fears in ways you have never had full visibility over. When the transformation process reaches this phase, the shadow starts to surface. And it surfaces not politely, not at a convenient time, not in a form that is easy to integrate. It surfaces in the sudden, irrational anger at someone who doesn't deserve it, in the strange attraction to a life completely unlike the one you have built, in the dreams that disturb you because they reveal a version of yourself you have been working very hard not to be, in the moments of raw, unfiltered feeling that break through the composure you have spent years perfecting. These are not symptoms of deterioration. They are evidence of integration. The parts of yourself that were too dangerous to acknowledge when you were small, when you needed to be acceptable, when survival required performance, those parts are coming back because you are now strong enough to hold them. The emergence of the shadow is not a sign that you are losing control. It is a sign that you are becoming whole enough to contain what you previously had to exile. The third phase is the most disorienting of all because it has no clear content. Jung called it simply the dissolution of the old self. And there's no elegant way to describe this phase because the experience of it resists description. It is the period where the old identity has lost its grip, but the new one has not yet formed. Where the story you used to tell about who you are no longer holds together, but there is no replacement story ready to take its place. Where you wake up in the morning and the question of who you are feels genuinely open in a way that is terrifying. And if you can hold it long enough without fleeing, secretly thrilling, this is the liminal space, the threshold, the place that every mythology and every wisdom tradition in human history has tried to prepare people for. Because it is the place where the most important thing that will ever happen to you is happening, and it feels like nothing at all. The people who flee this space, who grab the first available identity, the first available distraction, the first available version of certainty, pay for it later. They emerge from the process unchanged in the ways that mattered, wearing a new exterior over the same interior architecture. And within months or years, the pressure begins to build again, because the transformation that was interrupted does not cancel itself. It waits, and it comes back with more force the second time. Here is the thing no one tells you about the people who navigate this kind of transformation successfully. It is not that they are braver than everyone else. It is not that they have access to some rare psychological fortitude that most people simply weren't born with. It is not that they suffer less or feel less afraid or find the process any less disorienting than the people who get lost in it. The difference is far simpler and far more available than any of that. The people who come through genuine transformation intact, who emerge on the other side more real, more grounded, and more alive than they were before, are the people who stop trying to make the experience make sense too soon. They are the people who learned somehow to resist the most powerful instinct the human mind possesses. The instinct to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible, by any means necessary, even if the resolution is false. The human brain is at its most fundamental level a prediction machine. Every experience you have, every perception, every emotion is shaped by the brain's relentless attempt to predict what is happening and what will happen next. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The ability to anticipate, to pattern match, to build models of reality that allow you to navigate the world without having to consciously process every single piece of incoming information. This is what has allowed human beings to survive and build and create and connect. But this same machinery, which is so extraordinary in stable conditions, becomes a liability in periods of genuine transformation. Because the brain cannot tolerate a blank. It cannot sit comfortably in the space of not knowing who you are or where you are going or what the shape of your life is supposed to be. So it fills the blank. It reaches for the nearest available pattern, the nearest available identity, the nearest available version of certainty. And it does this not because the certainty is true, but because uncertainty is neurologically experienced as threat, and the brain will choose a false map over no map every time. This is why so many people who begin the transformation process end up making what appear to be radical changes but are actually subtle repetitions. They leave the marriage that was suffocating them and within 2 years have rebuilt the same dynamic with a different person. They quit the career that was killing them and within 18 months have recreated the same patterns of overwork and self-erasure in a different industry. They move cities, change their appearance, reinvent their social circle, and then look up one day and find that the interior landscape is almost identical to the one they left, because they moved before the internal work was complete, because they used external change as a substitute for internal transformation, because the brain, desperate to end the uncertainty, grabbed the first available resolution and called it growth. Real transformation has a different texture entirely. It is slower than the imitation. It is less dramatic. It does not announce itself on social media. It does not come with a clean narrative of before and after. It moves underground, in the quiet and the discomfort and the long stretches of not knowing, and it surfaces not as a story you tell about yourself, but as a way you move through the world that is simply unmistakably different. The people who know you well notice it before you can articulate it. Your tolerance for certain dynamics evaporates, not because you decided to have better boundaries, but because the part of you that needed those dynamics no longer exists. Your relationship to approval shifts not because you practiced affirmations, but because the wound that made approval feel like oxygen has finally been seen and held and integrated. The change is not performed, it is structural, and structural change cannot be rushed. So what do you actually do with this? If you cannot force the transformation to move faster, and you cannot flee the uncertainty without paying for it later, and you cannot reach for the nearest available identity without risk of repeating the same patterns in new clothing, what is the actual practice? What does it look like in the ordinary texture of daily life to meet this process with the intelligence it requires? The first thing is the hardest. You stop narrating. Most of us are running a continuous internal commentary on our own experience. We are not just feeling things, we are simultaneously interpreting them, categorizing them, assigning them meaning, and building them into a story that explains who we are and what is happening to us. This narration feels like self-awareness. It is often the opposite. It is the ego's attempt to maintain authorship over a process that has moved beyond its jurisdiction. And when you are in the middle of genuine transformation, the narration is almost always wrong. It is pulling from an outdated model of who you are, using categories that were built for the old self, trying to make meaning from a process whose meaning cannot yet be seen because it is not yet complete. Stopping the narration does not mean numbing yourself or becoming passive. It means learning to feel the experience without immediately converting it into a story. To sit with the discomfort of not knowing what the discomfort means, to let the grief be grief without immediately explaining what it is mourning, to let the fear be fear without immediately making it into a narrative about what you should do. The second thing is equally counterintuitive. You become radically honest about your actual experience, but you choose extremely carefully who you are honest with. Because here is a danger that almost no one warns you about when you are in the middle of transformation. The people who love you, who genuinely care about you and want the best for you, are often the most destabilizing presence you can be around during this process. Not because they are malicious, but because their image of you is built on the old version. And when you begin to change, when the old patterns start dissolving and the new self starts emerging in fragments and impulses and unfamiliar desires, the people who love the old version will, with the very best intentions, try to pull you back to it. They will express concern when your life starts to look different from what it looked like before. They will offer the language of worry. Are you okay? This doesn't seem like you. Maybe you should talk to someone. Not because something is wrong, but because something is changing, and changing in people we love feels like loss to the people who love them. This is why the quality of your environment during transformation is not peripheral. It is central. You need at least one person, ideally more, who can hold space for a version of you that is not yet fully formed, who does not need you to be certain or consistent or explainable, who can sit with you in the not knowing without immediately trying to resolve it into something comfortable for them. These people are rare, but they are findable. And finding them is not a luxury during this process. It is a survival requirement. The third thing, and this is the one that separates transformation from mere suffering, is developing what can only be described as a quality of curious attention toward your own interior, not analysis, not interpretation, not the relentless self-examination that becomes another form of control, but a genuine, open, almost scientific curiosity about what is actually happening inside you. What does this grief actually feel like in the body, and where does it live? What is underneath the anger? What more vulnerable thing? Is the anger protecting? What does the restlessness actually want? If you follow it past the surface impulse to its actual source, this quality of curious attention is the thing that transforms suffering into information. It is the difference between being dragged through the process unconsciously and moving through it with the kind of awareness that allows you to actually metabolize what is happening rather than simply enduring it. Jung spent decades watching people move through this passage, and the observation he returned to most consistently was this: the people who came through it most fully were not the most disciplined or the most intelligent or the most psychologically sophisticated. They were the most honest. Honest about what they actually felt beneath what they were supposed to feel. Honest about what they actually wanted beneath what they had been performing wanting. Honest about who they actually were beneath the accumulated layers of adaptation and approval seeking and survival. Honesty in this context is not a moral virtue. It is a navigational instrument. It is the only compass that works in the territory you are currently moving through. And it will take you somewhere the old self never could have reached, because the old self was built in part on the avoidance of exactly this kind of seeing. There is a particular kind of mourning that people who have moved through genuine transformation describe, not the mourning after a breakthrough, not the mourning after a dramatic decision or a cathartic conversation, or the kind of peak experience that feels significant in the moment, but fades within weeks. A different kind of mourning entirely. An ordinary mourning, unremarkable in every external detail, where they wake up and the weight is simply gone, not resolved, not explained, not justified by any new achievement or relationship or circumstance, just gone. And in its place, something quieter and more durable than anything they had been chasing before. A settled quality of presence, a sense of occupying their own life rather than managing it from a careful distance. A relationship with themselves that does not require constant maintenance because it is no longer built on performance. This morning does not arrive on a schedule. It cannot be earned through effort or accelerated through technique, but it arrives. For the people who stay with the process long enough, who resist the temptation to flee into false resolution, who keep returning to the honest interior even when the honest interior is uncomfortable and unclear and offers no immediate reward, it arrives. And when it does, they understand something that cannot be fully communicated to someone who has not yet crossed the same threshold. They understand that everything they went through was not happening to them. It was happening for them. Not in the naive sense that suffering is secretly a gift, but in the precise and specific sense that the psyche is intelligent, that it does not generate pressure without purpose, that the dissolution of the old self was not a malfunction. It was the most sophisticated act of self-preservation the deeper self knows how to perform. This is the thing the competitor content gestures toward, but never quite lands on directly. The transformation is not a spiritual metaphor. It is not a poetic framework for making sense of difficulty after the fact. It is a biological, neurological, psychological process with a structure and a direction and an internal logic that has been operating in human beings for as long as human beings have existed. Every wisdom, tradition, and recorded history has built ritual and language around this passage. Not because ancient people were primitive and needed mythology to explain what they couldn't understand, says scientifically, but because the passage itself is real, and the people who went through it recognized that it required preparation, guidance, and a framework capable of holding the magnitude of what was happening. The vision quest, the dark night of the soul, the hero's descent, the ego death described in contemplative traditions across cultures and centuries. These are not separate phenomena given different names. They are descriptions of the same underlying process, observed independently across thousands of years of human experience, because the process is not cultural. It is constitutional. It is built into the architecture of what it means to be a human being who grows. What changes in the modern context is not the process itself, but the conditions surrounding it. Because we live in a world that has an extraordinary capacity to prevent transformation from completing. Not through malice, through convenience. The moment the discomfort becomes significant enough to demand attention, there are 10,000 available mechanisms for making it stop. The substance, the screen, the new relationship that temporarily floods the system with enough neurochemical novelty to silence the deeper signal, the achievement that restores the sense of forward momentum just long enough to make the underlying restlessness seem manageable again. None of these things are evil. Most of them are genuinely pleasurable, but used in the service of avoiding the transformation that is trying to complete itself, they become the most sophisticated form of self-sabotage available. Because they don't feel like avoidance. They feel like living. They feel like making reasonable choices in the face of difficulty. They feel like self-care and pragmatism and not wallowing. And they are none of those things. They are the ego's most elegant defense against the very process that would finally set it free. This is why the question of attention is not peripheral to this conversation. It is the entire conversation. What you give your attention to during this period is not a lifestyle choice. It is a determinant of outcome. The person who meets this passage with their attention turned inward, who stays curious about what is actually happening beneath the surface, who tolerates the uncertainty long enough for the real signal to emerge from the noise. That person completes the transformation. The person who meets this passage with their attention turned permanently outward, managing the surface, maintaining the performance, optimizing the external life to compensate for the interior collapse. That person delays the transformation, and the delay is always temporary, because the psyche does not abandon what it has begun. It simply accumulates more pressure and tries again, later, with more force, through a larger crack. Jung made an observation near the end of his career that has stayed with me in the way that genuinely true things stay with you, not as an idea you agree with, but as a recognition of something you already knew without having the words for it. He said that the most common form of human despair is not the despair of people whose lives have fallen apart. It is the despair of people whose lives are working perfectly and who cannot understand why that is not enough. It is the despair of the constructed self at the height of its construction. A person who achieved everything they set out to achieve and discovered standing at the summit that the summit was not where they actually needed to go. That the entire climb, the sacrifice, the discipline, the years of working toward this precise configuration of success was oriented toward a destination chosen not by who they actually are, but by who they needed to appear to be. And that the life waiting for them, the real one, the one that fits, is not at the top of the mountain they climbed. It is somewhere the old self never would have thought to look. This is the gift concealed inside the disorientation you are carrying right now. Not a comfortable gift, not a gift that comes wrapped in the packaging you would have chosen, but the most significant gift the psyche can offer, the gift of being pointed with unmistakable force away from the life that was never truly yours and toward the one that is. The loss of meaning is not the death of meaning. It is the withdrawal of meaning from structures too small to hold who you are becoming, so that it can be reinvested in something large enough to actually contain you. The collapse of tolerance is not the end of your capacity for relationship and connection. It is the end of your willingness to contract yourself into shapes designed for someone else's comfort at the expense of your own reality. The dissolution of the old identity is not the destruction of who you are. It is the uncovering of who you always were, beneath the layers of adaptation that were necessary once and have now become the only obstacle remaining between you and a life that is genuinely, unmistakably, irreversibly yours. The crossing is not comfortable. No crossing worth making ever is. But on the other side of it is something that most people spend their entire lives pursuing through external means and never quite reaching. not because it is rare or reserved for the exceptional few, but because it cannot be reached from the outside. It can only be uncovered from within. A quality of aliveness that is not dependent on circumstances being favorable. A groundedness that is not shaken by the opinions of people who only knew the old version of you. A clarity about what actually matters that cuts through the noise of a world that is very good at telling you what shall de-matter and very poor at helping you find what actually does. And a relationship with your own life that is no longer mediated by fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being too much, fear of the gap between who you are and who you have been performing. Being finally, irreversibly seen. You are standing at the threshold, not because you chose this moment, because the deeper intelligence that has been running the longer calculation decided with a precision you don't have full access to yet that you are ready. Not that the timing is convenient, not that you have all the resources in place, or the support structures aligned, or the understanding fully formed. Ready in the only sense that matters, that you have accumulated enough experience, enough suffering, enough glimpses of a life that could be yours to survive the crossing from the one you have been living to the one that has been waiting. The only question left is the one young spent his career returning to, the one that every person who has stood where you are standing has eventually had to answer for themselves. Not whether the change is coming. That has already been decided. In a room of the psyche you don't have a key to, but whether you will meet it with your eyes open, whether you will let it do what it came to do, whether you will have the particular and irreplaceable courage it takes to stop holding the old life together long enough for the new one to finally show you what it is. Everything is about to change, not because the universe is rearranging itself around you, because you already have.